Hi everybody. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your final project as we're gearing up for this culmination of a lot of work to get to this particular point. So this is just kind of an overview of some of the things to keep in mind as you're working on your final project. So first of all, as you're editing your work, I would recommend that you make big structural changes first. That means go through and think about reordering your paragraphs or editing the content of your paragraphs, adding in paragraphs for content that might be missing. Go through and do those big, enormous shifts first before you get into the hairy details and polish. So really think about reworking a paragraph before you edit for grammar or address APA style formatting. Make big changes first, polish last. That's a basic rule of thumb when it comes to editing. So you want to save things like grammar, APA style, paragraph transitions, those bells and whistles for the very end after you're sure that the structure that you have in place is solid and that you have the content that you need. As a reminder, Grammarly is free, and I recommend that you start taking a look at using something like that to help you with your writing. The whole goal behind this is to make sure that you're not fiddling with a sentence until you're sure that it belongs. There's a famous phrase called, "Don't be afraid to kill your darlings," when it comes to writing. And what that means is that sometimes you can get really enamored of a sentence or a turn of phrase, but that entire paragraph might not necessarily belong there. Or you might have to rework the paragraph and that sentence doesn't work anymore. Or you might focus in on a particular sentence and fix it, and because you've spent so much time fixing it, you don't think about whether that sentence needs to be there or not. So focus on the big picture ideas first, and then start tinkering with wording. Hopefully that makes sense. I can't recommend this enough. Reading a paper out loud is always an excellent process to identify when there's awkward turns of phrase, when something is grammatically inappropriate, when it sticks a little bit or is awkward or difficult to understand. This is a process that I always go through in the final phase of my editing. I read the paper out loud from start to finish, and then I use that to highlight phrases that I need to address. I also recommend that you have enough time with this so that you can do some editing, walk away, and come back the next day to really take a look at the paper with a new set of eyes. When you are working at a paper continuously, it can sometimes be hard for you to catch mistakes. You can sometimes read over a paper and miss very obvious things. And having that space to be able to come back to a paper after a day or even two lets you look at it with a fresh set of eyes and find things that you wouldn't otherwise find if you were trying to do it all in one big lump. I want you to remember that scientific writing is a different kind of writing than the writing you might have done in English classes. It's very utilitarian, it's to the point, it addresses only the information that is needed without bells and whistles. So it's important to get to the point and to use straightforward, approachable language. Now, not all the sources that you've read have done this. I want you to be better than them. I want you to express complicated ideas and summarize other people's research using your own straightforward words that are easy for other people to understand. I think it's an incredibly valuable skill to be able to express complexity with simple language. And keep in mind that you only want to mention relevant information. You would only talk about another study's specific scale that they used if you were using that scale in your study. Otherwise, just focus on the overall pattern of results. You wouldn't mention the population that another study used in your summary unless that was a point of critique or comparison. So for example, if they found a certain finding but only with elementary school students, then you might say, oh, well, they were studying elementary school students. I think this will apply to college students, and here's why. But you would only mention it if it was relevant to an argument that you were making or a point that you thought would be important. Otherwise, don't include it. And once again, you should think about how the information that you're presenting relates to your study and your hypotheses. And if the information you're providing doesn't relate, then it doesn't belong. Each paragraph should be about one central topic or idea. For the most part, you guys have been fairly good about this, but every now and then I left a note for you that said these are two separate ideas, it should be two separate paragraphs. And if you make an assertion, cite it. I tried to be consistent about this in my feedback when you had this particular issue. So whenever you see a note that says cite, that means that you've made a statement that requires a citation in order to affirm what it is that you're saying. If you don't have a resource that provides evidence for that, then don't make it an assertion. Make it conditional. Say this might be the case, or it might be, or it's widely believed that, something that's a little softer than everyone knows that this is the case, right? So make it a conditional statement as opposed to a statement of fact. Here are just some ideas of transition phrases that you can use at the start of a paragraph. Similarly, if you're trying to link different ideas together, clearly would be a good one if you're trying to kind of bring it to a narrower point or make a connection. When you're contrasting, you might say by contrast or on the other hand or however if you've got an exception. I really like this particular model just because it helps set up different connections between the paragraphs. If you have 3 different potential causes, then you might talk about it as here's the first cause, here's the second cause, here's the third cause, and start off your transitionary phrases between your paragraphs with these particular markers to let the reader follow that you're making 3 different arguments, and to kind of tie things together. Other phrases that show that you're connecting ideas together could be in addition or another factor that could lead to this particular outcome or influence this particular phenomenon as a way to go, here's one, here's another. And starting those phrases in that particular way ties those paragraphs together and makes it part of a cohesive whole. When you're trying to make an argument based in logic after you present other people's research, you might follow it with a therefore, or it follows that, or an in conclusion. Here's some general formatting considerations. So this is when you click on paragraph in the latest version of Word. You want it to be Times New Roman 12-point font, and you want it to be double spaced throughout. If you'll notice the spacing section below at the very bottom, oftentimes they'll have spacing where after an enter key, there's an 8-point space, which actually provides a quadruple space instead of a double space. So I like to set everything to 0 so that it's just double space without any extra bells and whistles, so that before and after are both set to 0 and that the line spacing is set to double. That way I don't have any extra spacing. So if you got any feedback indicating just double space, no extra spacing, that's a way to help solve that particular problem so that when you hit the enter key, it just brings it down to the next line rather than skipping an additional line. And once again, keep in mind you want to format your citations in APA style. Let me know if you have any questions about that, if you got any feedback indicating you need some help with APA style. And I also want you to pay attention to your headers. I'm going to have an example on the next page that walks you through your headers. Keep in mind that unless I ask for it, I'm not going to be grading it. So if I'm not asking for something like an abstract, a title page, extra bells and whistles, then you don't need to provide it. We're going to go through a lot more detail next semester when it comes to formatting. Keep in mind that unless I'm asking explicitly for it, you don't need to provide it in this particular proposal. This is just an example of headers. Some of you were a little confused by how to format the headings. So you can see the section heading, which would be something like methods, is bolded and centered, and then subsequent subsections like participants, procedure, materials would be under subsection heading, which is flush left and bolded with the text below it tabbed, starting on a new line. You can see that if you have additional subsections within that subsection, so for example, if you have a materials section that includes multiple measures within it, then you would tab, bold, and put a period, and then the text would immediately follow after. So if you had 3 different measures within your materials section, that would be how you'd format those in terms of labeling them properly. When it comes to the order of your paper, you have the body of your paper. In this particular case, The body of your paper consists of your introduction and method section. You can think of this as continuous. So the method section wouldn't start on its own page. It would just flow and be set apart by the headings. So when you start your paper, you should have the title at the top of your page, centered and not bolded. And then when you get into your method section, that is a specific section heading. It should be centered and bolded. I didn't come up with the rules, I just enforced them. Your references start on a brand new page. So if you end your methods section in the middle of a page, you would start your references on a brand new page rather than continually. And references, the word, would be centered and not bolded. Once again, I don't come up with the rules, but that's what they are. Your appendices would go following your references, and they would each be on a separate page. And that's the typical order that we would put a paper in terms of manuscript. When it comes to general Phase 4 feedback, here are a few things that I noticed. First of all, keep in mind that when it comes to recruitment, if you're recruiting general psych students, that's through a bulletin board post. You might also want to clarify when you have a specialized population that you might especially want to recruit, like athletes or a certain race or a certain gender or a certain diagnosis. So keep in mind when you have a specialized population that you might need to engage in additional recruitment in order to bring those people into your study, and think through how you might do that. A lot of you did a very good job describing the risks in your study, but then you need to take it one step further. You need to go ahead and clarify that this is a minimal risk classification because it involves a risk no greater than that you could expect to experience during a course of a normal day. And some of you need to take it a little bit further and clarify why that is something you could expect to experience during a course of a normal day. So you need to work a little bit more on being explicit about why it would clarify as a minimal risk study. Some of you also need to go into a little bit more detail about reducing risk. So for example, things like participants can skip over any question for any reason, and they can leave the study at any time without penalty, would be very classic ways of reducing risk. If you have a study that might have a slightly higher risk of triggering something, for example, like an eating disorder or suicidal ideation, then you might provide counseling services information on the informed consent form. So there are ways to kind of up the amount of risk that you can mitigate through the information you provide. Also, letting people know about the purpose of the study at the very beginning can be a way to reduce risk, so that if somebody, for example, is very afraid of speaking in public, then by letting them know that they'll be asked to do that, they could potentially opt out of that particular study before they agree to participate and have that sprung on them. When it comes to confidentiality, some of you were overthinking this a little bit. Keep in mind that the simplest way to maintain confidentiality is to keep any information that includes participants' names, like an informed consent form, stored in a separate file from the rest of the data, and that the data is otherwise stored in a protected location. We'll go through a little bit more about what that might entail for your particular study, but for now, just thinking through that particular level of things is going to be sufficient.